Thank you, Patrick, and welcome. The subject of our work, violence, maims and kills, bringing mayhem to victims, to perpetrators, bystanders, and those who know them. Let us take a moment of silence to reflect on this truth. Thank you. Meeting planners asked me to begin our deliberations with a reading. The essay I will share is called Vaccines for Violence. It is one of 5 I wrote as I retired from professional life about 5 years ago. As I read this piece, which takes about 12 minutes, you will realize I am preaching to you as the choir. That is, you know the field of public health and what it can do. But stories about why and how we prevent violence, coupled with the illumination from scientific knowledge, will be the building blocks of change. So I hope you'll be inspired to write your own stories. They could have a role to play in helping people outside of our field understanding the power and the possibility of prevention. So vaccines for violence. Could anything have been more ordinary in the early 1960s than a teenage daughter helping her mother prepare a dinner for a family of 6? In my case, Mom phoned every afternoon from her secretary's desk at a law office in Main Street, Sag Harbor, New York, and told me to make the potatoes scalloped or mashed, and whether or not to open a package of frozen peas. Sometimes she let me make a bowl of Jell-O. When she arrived home an hour later, our family gathered promptly at the evening meal, and I felt pleasure at helping her feed her brood. But little else seemed routine in that decade, and especially one afternoon when I jolted our evening ritual with the question, Ma, if the atom bomb lands in New York City, what are you going to do with us? That day, I had overheard my history teacher whispering in the hallway to my science teacher, Russians, Cuba, warships. I knew they were frightened and what caused it. Without pause, as she stirred flour into the gravy, Mom turned slowly to me. Why, Fran, I would take all of you right down to Noyac Bay and drown you. And that was how I learned, as a child, one act of violence could lead to the next. Now I wonder what our world had come to. A mother's best hope of protecting her children was to kill them. My education in violence started years before this conversation and went on long after. My life felt steeped in the physical violence of one parent, the sexual violence of the other. By middle school, I had spent years responding to alarms from air raid systems, learning how to duck under my desk, shield my face from blown glass if disaster struck. Through the media, I inhaled a steady stream of toxic images, such as rioting in cities across America, police shooting students on a college campus, and assassinations of our leaders. Then by the 1970s, as the Vietnam War ended and I entered my 20s, I became prey to the widespread epidemic of robbery and personal attack, which erupted in many cities. One time, when driving in Washington, D.C. with a friend, my car lost power and we pulled off the road. A man who had been biking stopped, chatted, and helped to fix the car. After he left, we were shocked to find that he had stolen my wallet. Another time, young men mugged me at knife point. Soon after one of these thefts, I attended a concert at which Joan Baez sang, as only she could, about opening the prison doors and letting everyone go. I didn't agree. I wanted someone to hold those men accountable. Yet, like Baez, I knew that bars locked in the problem of crime and violence, but did not hold the key to its solution. More than another quarter century has now gone. I have been living with what violence has wrought for nearly 60 years. If I were the only victim, I could bear the cost. Instead, more than 1.5 million die each year from violence, and many more are devastated by it. People across the globe suffer as if from a plague, and my thinking comes to this. No one in their right mind wakes up hoping they will have a violence-soaked day. No one brings an infant into this world praying to fill their child's days with abuse. And yet many of us accept violence as part of the human condition. Absent vision, who possesses the strength to see the problem through to its solution? Who among us musters the will to change? I find courage in my search to prevent violence when I seek other people who have harnessed their imaginations in the service of change. I turn, for example, to Dr. Louis Pasteur. Dr. Pasteur in 1821 advanced germ theory and proposed inoculation to build up antibodies and immunity to infectious disease. Scientists took another 100 years to develop the first vaccine, but by the turn of our millennium, medicine offered vaccines for all 11 of the major childhood killers like smallpox and polio, measles, and mumps. Today, 99% of the sicknesses that would have been caused by those infections are prevented. In industrialized countries, doctors immunize widely and most children live until adulthood. Yet just 200 years ago, many parents lost their infants and young children to infectious disease. In poor countries, they still do. So think about it. Think about all those parents for so many generations grieving the loss of their babies and children, powerless before the symptoms, the course of the illness, and the outcome. They must have believed that disease was inevitable, not preventable. And so it is with violence. Violence travels like the microbes that cause disease in the news, in the movies, in the home, and in each other. And it strikes like a disease, spreading from one person, group, or country to another in an endless cycle of hurt. We stumble about in an era like the one before doctors could peer into a microscope to see the causes of disease. Instead of looking at the origins of violence, some people use shame to change another's behavior. Others of us attribute violent acts to moral flaws and say religion will bring God's grace and heal people of their sins. Others still search for political and human rights solutions, arguing correctly that no one should be a victim of another's abuse. We fill our jails with those who do not respect that right. But while the rule of law provides a foundation, alone it will not end violence. When we punish after the fact, we do not probe or treat causes. Moral and political approaches are necessary, but not sufficient to prevent violence. As practitioners of medicine did long ago before the advent of germ theory, we help as best we can when we deal with the symptoms. But could we don a doctor's coat and become Pasteur? Long before the medical system existed, Pasteur used foresight to assume childhood health, not disease, was the human condition. So, too, we must conceive that vitality, not violence, constitute our birthright. We must look deeply into biological, behavioral, and social causes of violence. Using a cool head of reason and a warm heart of caring, we must discover and promote vaccines for violence. And what would a vaccine look like? Scientists have found that without attachment, babies will not thrive and children will become aggressive. Studies by social psychologists have shown that adolescents randomly placed in groups can be taught to compete in a way that escalates to violence, or they can be taught skills of empathy and cooperation. Other studies have proven that adults become vulnerable to abuse by others when they're isolated and lack social networks. From my own experience with abuse, I know that people who suffer violence can live with the pain so intense and so hidden, it destroys their ability to allow the human touch. I have lived at times with such a handicap, and I wonder if societies suffer in a similar manner. Can it be that we're unable to deal with the rage and grief and fear that surface in the face of violence that we have individually and collectively already experienced? Is it possible we mistake violence as part of the human condition when instead our lives are scarred by the millions among us who lack capacity for secure attachment? I vaccinate myself from becoming violent when I connect to another person. Like a series of building blocks, I connect first to myself through awareness of my needs, then to others through observing what they need. I connect to people in my community, then to my nation, and to the healthy values my society holds. I don't assume that connecting alone will prevent violence. Society must attend both to an individual's acts and to his or her environment. Drawing upon the model of curing infectious disease, I keep in mind how scientists look not only for vaccines, but for all the causes of infections that spread through populations. Governments take responsibility for eliminating exposure to sewage, to water, to airborne viruses, to exchanges of body fluids, to exposure to sick animals and birds. In this way, human ingenuity confronts the devastation of infectious disease, dismantles it, and lays out a plan for eradication. If our society held a similar spirit of inquiry about violence, people would open themselves to multiple paths to inoculate against it. They would look for a more wholesome society to surround them. Perhaps they would demand media and messages that are health-giving. If violence entertains them, they would ask why. More people would learn skills of conflict resolution so that differences of opinion did not erupt into violent behavior. For example, more of us would become expert at recognizing bullying behavior in children, adults, or groups, and develop skillful ways of diffusing it, or if need be, containing it. More of us would learn about and support programs that have proven to lessen violence. For example, when nurses trained in parenting skills visit young, first-time mothers during pregnancy and for 2 years after birth, their children grow up to resist violent behaviors more often than children not given such social support. In impoverished townships of South Africa, women given social and economic incentives have remained 50% more free of domestic violence and HIV infection than women not given such help. People would appreciate that jobs and economic well-being become vaccines for violence because poverty, especially alongside wealth, correlates with violence. People would understand the role that law enforcement and criminal justice systems need to play to provide the right dosage of accountability that violent acts require. We would help these systems build connection and relationship instead of severing it. And citizens would support governments that provide prevention programs for those who are vulnerable to perpetrating or being victimized by abuse. Thinking back to my childhood and my fear of a bomb falling on New York City makes me wonder about the nature of my parents' capacity to form attachment, and also about their ignorance about the violence they acted out and contemplated. What had my mother experienced that frightened her enough to consider drowning her children? Perhaps she and my father discussed his last experiences in World War II. He spoke to me about it only once, on the 50-year anniversary of the dropping of the bomb in Japan. He was one of the few people to behold what the United States had wrought in 1945. As an enlisted sailor on the Navy ship that entered the harbor of Nagasaki just after that deadly act, my father's job allowed a peek through the slightly open door of the engine room, just enough to take in the sweeping 180-degree expanse, twisted remnants of buildings, wisps of smoke, and bodies floating next to debris. He had seen what humans could do to one another. I have seen into hell, Fran, something that cuts that deep you never forget. I think of my parents and their abusive actions, and I wonder, what else were they to do? Would I have acted any differently if I had lived their lives? I think not. Perhaps facing violence with a new attitude feels impossible, as if what one person, what you can do, could never be enough. Yet if we bring ourselves to a problem with good intention and give of ourselves, it is plenty. I find inspiration again in the talent and imagination of one who came before me, Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy 700 years ago. Dante offered himself as a pilgrim for truth into human behavior and its consequences. Stunning by virtue of its language and metaphor, his allegory takes the reader through horrifying realms of hell and purgatory, finally to achieve paradise. At the beginning of his journey, when stepping through the doorway of hell, Dante glanced up to read a chilling inscription chiseled into the stone. It ended with the warning, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Traveling down, spiral after spiral, the reader looks over the author's shoulder to see souls trapped by their greed, hatred, and jealousy. But Dante could not attempt the roiling landscape alone. He beckoned his venerable mentor, Virgil, as a guide to the descent, and Beatrice, the woman he loved, to serve as a muse for the journey. In that gesture, he gifted humanity with the recognition that we need more than knowledge to brave the unknown. We need the human touch. We need connection. Dante charted the terrain for how the rest of us can confront the awful and keep going until we find the good. We can find a guide who will breathe life into our vision, more even than a hope, of searching for and finding the vaccines for violence. Together, we will witness the power that flows when we face the worst humans create and change it. When I use my intelligence and my heart in the service of preventing violence, I feel a surge of power course through me. The task which once engulfed me instead bugles a wake-up call. What I do, what each of us does to connect to others in our daily life feeds not only us, but the life in our families, in our community, in the body of our nation, and who we become as a people. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce one of the co-chairs of our workshop, Sheldon Greenberg, who will invite us to enjoy the day.